The French West India Company transformed 12 million human beings into tools of production and made an island the size of the American state of Maryland the source of 2/3 of all of France's foreign revenue in the 18th century. It wasn't France, it was a company with shareholders, directors, and balance sheets. And while that company was writing the most profitable ledgers in colonial history, it was also writing a system of death so efficient that it needed to import 30,000 Africans per year just to replace those who died of exhaustion. What's impossible to understand at first is why it lasted, why no power intervened, why the civilized world, debating Rousseau and Locke in the candlelit salons of Paris, looked at Saint-Domingue and saw only opportunity. The answer to that question changes everything you think you know about who built the modern world. If this kind of history interests you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, before today, did you know the name Saint-Domingue? To understand how an island became the most profitable cog on the planet, you have to understand why sugar wasn't just a food. It was power. In the 16th century, a kilogram of sugar was worth the same as a kilogram of gold in parts of Europe. Kings served it at banquets to display wealth. Doctors prescribed it as medicine. The church used it in ceremonies. It was a product so rare, so coveted, so transformative that European powers were willing to reshape the entire world to get it. Christopher Columbus understood that before anyone else. In 1493, on his second voyage to the Caribbean, he didn't just bring flags and crosses. He brought sugarcane cuttings. It was a deliberate, calculated act, with consequences that would stretch across 4 centuries. The Caribbean had everything sugar needed: rich volcanic soil, abundant rainfall, constant heat. What it lacked was labor. The Taino and Kalinago peoples, who inhabited the islands before European arrival, were wiped out within decades by disease, massacre, and forced labor. When the colonizers realized that the native population would not survive the system they had built, they looked to Africa. And that is where the greatest economic crime in human history began. The triangular trade was elegant in its horror. Ships left Europe loaded with weapons, textiles, and manufactured goods. They reached the African coast, exchanged those goods for human beings captured in wars and raids, crossed the Atlantic on what was called the Middle Passage, and arrived in the Caribbean with human cargo that would be sold as property. From there, they returned to Europe with sugar, rum, and molasses. The cycle repeated without end. Between 1620 and 1850, between 11 and 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. More than 90% of them were destined for sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Fewer than 5% arrived in what would become the United States. American slavery, so central to Anglophone historical memory, was a smaller fraction of the system. The heart of the horror was in the islands. And the heart of the islands was Saint-Domingue. The French colony on the western third of Hispaniola began as an accident. Pirates and buccaneers who settled on the island of Tortuga in the 17th century gradually became colonists. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 formalized what was already a fact. Spain recognized French control over that strip of land. What no one foresaw at that moment was that that strip of land would become the most profitable enterprise of the following century. The system the French built in Saint-Domingue was not improvised. It was designed with industrial precision to extract the maximum possible in the shortest time possible. And that precision had a human cost that numbers reveal better than any description. In 1681, there were 2,000 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue. 100 years later, in 1789, there were 500,000. That growth did not come from natural reproduction. It came from constant importation. Conditions on the plantations were so brutal that the population could not reproduce fast enough to sustain the system. A British planter from Barbados named Edward Littleton calculated, without remorse, that an owner of 100 enslaved people would work them all to death within 19 years in the cane fields. In Saint-Domingue, the annual mortality rate on plantations reached 15%. 15% of the workforce died every year, from exhaustion, disease, and violence at the hands of overseers. To keep the system running, 30,000 new Africans had to be imported each year. In some years, that number reached 40,000. The mill and the boiling house ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The enslaved were divided into two 12-hour shifts. The cane couldn't wait. The sugar couldn't wait. The profit couldn't wait. What this system produced is difficult to comprehend on a human scale. In 1789, on the eve of the French Revolution, Saint-Domingue exported 86,000 tons of sugar and 35,000 tons of coffee. It produced approximately half of all the sugar consumed in Europe and more than half of the world's coffee. The total value of those exports accounted for 2/3 of all of France's foreign trade. An island the size of Maryland, 2/3 of the foreign revenue of the second greatest power in Europe. And all the while, that same year, that same France, was debating the natural rights of man in the salons of Paris. But what sustained this machine was not only the violence on the plantations. It was a complete system, legal, financial, military, and cultural, built to ensure that extraction would continue indefinitely. The Code Noir, the slavery code promulgated by Louis XIV in 1685, was the system's operating manual. It defined the enslaved as movable property. It established punishments for escape, mutilation, branding with a hot iron, death. At the same time, it created the appearance of regulation. It theoretically prohibited excessive torture, required masters to feed their enslaved people. In practice, it was a document that legalized the ownership of human beings while constructing a fiction of protection. Colonial society in Saint-Domingue had a stratification so rigid it functioned like a work of social engineering. At the top, white European colonists, the Grands Blancs, large landowners with political and economic power. Below them, the Petits Blancs, merchants, artisans, landless white men who compensated for their poverty with the racial superiority the law guaranteed them. Then the affranchis, free people of color, often mixed race, children of relationships between masters and enslaved women. The affranchis came to own 1/3 of the colony's plantation properties and 1/4 of its enslaved people, but could not hold public office or practice certain professions. And at the bottom, 500,000 enslaved people sustaining everything. The system was designed so that each layer hated the one below it and envied the one above, so that the affranchis wanted to be recognized as white, and the Petits Blancs hated them for aspiring to the same status. It was a mechanism of division that worked as long as fear and profit sustained it. The problem was that the system had a fundamental flaw, and the architects of the colony knew it. But terror did not eliminate resistance, it only delayed it. In August 1791, the crack the colonists had always feared became an abyss. The Vodou ceremony at Bois Caïman on the night of August 14, 1791, is the founding moment of the only successful slave revolution in human history. The Hungan Dutty Boukman presided over the ritual that sealed the pact among the leaders of the insurrection. A few days later, in the early hours of August 22nd, the plantations of northern Saint-Domingue began to burn. Within weeks, more than 100,000 people had joined the rebellion. Hundreds of plantations were destroyed. The most profitable machinery in the colonial world was in flames. What followed was a war that lasted more than a decade and drew France, Spain, Great Britain, and Haiti itself into a conflict of a complexity no historian can resolve in a few sentences. Toussaint Louverture, a 50-year-old former enslaved man with extraordinary military intelligence, emerged as the leader no one expected. He He repelled British and Spanish invasions. He liberated the enslaved on the Spanish side of the island. In 1801, he declared himself ruler of Saint-Domingue. Napoleon could not accept that, not because Toussaint was a military threat to continental France, but because Saint-Domingue was the crown jewel of the colonial empire, and because the idea of a free black republic in the Caribbean terrified every slave society in the hemisphere. In February 1802, 86 ships and 22,000 soldiers arrived on the shores of Saint-Domingue. Napoleon's brother-in-law, General Victoire Leclerc, commanded the expedition. The objective was to reconquer the colony and restore slavery. The mission failed in ways Napoleon had not foreseen. Yellow fever decimated the French army before it could consolidate control. Toussaint was captured through betrayal and died in prison in the frozen mountains of the Jura in France in 1803. But the revolution outlived its leader. Jean-Jacques Dessalines took command and led to final victory what Napoleon had tried to suppress. On November 18, 1803, at the Battle of Vertières, the indigenous army defeated the French forces. The French general Rochambeau surrendered Cap Français. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines announced the new nation of Haiti, the first free black republic in the modern world, the second independent republic in the Americas, and the only country in history born of a victorious slave revolution. Before the fighting ended, 100,000 of the 500,000 black people and 24,000 of the 40,000 white people of Saint-Domingue had died. The most profitable machine in the colonial world was destroyed. And that is where the second part of the crime begins. Haitian independence did not bring peace. It brought calculated isolation. The United States, under Thomas Jefferson, severed relations with Haiti. A president who wrote about liberty and equality while owning more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his life could not recognize a republic born of a slave revolution. The fear was that the Haitian example would spread to the plantations of the American South. France went further. In 1825, King Charles II sent warships to the port of Port-au-Prince with a demand. Haiti would pay 150 million gold francs as reparations, compensation to the former plantation owners for the property they had lost. For property, for the men, women, and children who had won their own freedom. The alternative was war and permanent isolation. Haiti paid. The debt was later reduced to 90 million francs, the equivalent of $21 billion in 2004 values. In 1825, that amount represented 300% of Haiti's GDP. The country took out loans from French banks at high interest rates to pay the former slave owners. By 1898, half of the Haitian government's budget went to those payments. By 1914, the proportion had risen to 80%. The debt was fully paid off in 1947, 122 years after it was imposed. One generation paid, then another, then another. And while Haiti bled capital to Paris for more than a century, in 1915, the United States invaded the country. President Woodrow Wilson sent in the Marines to restore order. In December 1914, 8 Marines had already entered the Haitian National Bank and removed the country's gold reserves, approximately $500,000, in wooden crates, transported to the vault of the National City Bank in New York. During the 19 years of American occupation, the United States used 40% of Haiti's national income to pay debts to American and French banks. The National City Bank, today Citibank, took control of Haiti's national bank. 15,000 Haitians were killed. 50,000 peasants lost their land. And when the Marines finally left in 1934, they continued to control Haiti's public finances until 1947. The sequence is impossible to attribute to coincidence. Haiti was the wealthiest country in the Americas in the 18th century. It became the poorest. That outcome was not a historical inevitability. It was constructed, step by step, by decisions made by governments and financial institutions that chose to punish the only successful slave revolution in history. What Saint-Domingue reveals, when you look at the whole picture, is a system of power that operates beyond the borders of nation-states. It was not the French government alone. It was the shareholders of the colonial companies, the bankers of Paris and London, the merchants of Nantes and Bordeaux who owned entire fleets. France employed 750 ships exclusively for trade with Saint-Domingue. The American senators from the slave states, the directors of the National City Bank. Sugar was the product. Profit was the objective. And the system to guarantee that profit spread across continents survived revolutions and created structures of inequality that still exist. 200 years after Haitian independence, Haiti is the poorest country in the Americas, with 80% of its population living below the poverty line. The 2010 earthquake caused $7.8 billion in damages in a country that barely had the infrastructure to absorb the impact. The United Nations allocated more than $13 billion in aid between 2010 and 2020. The country remains dependent. There is a direct line between the first load of sugarcane Columbus brought ashore in the Caribbean in 1493 and the Haiti of today. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented, dated chain of cause and effect, with names, figures, and signatures. The question that remains is not why Haiti is poor. That answer exists and was documented in this episode. The question that remains is why we still call it fate, or underdevelopment, instead of calling it by its name. The result of a systematic project of extraction that lasted 400 years and was never repaired. Everyone who consumed sugar in Europe between 1650 and 1804 participated in that system. Every government that recognized the French indemnity as legitimate in 1825 participated in that system. Every bank that charged interest on loans meant to pay slave owners participated in that system. History did not end in 1804. The history of private empires does not end with declarations of independence. If you want to keep understanding how this mechanism works, how private power shapes entire nations before governments realize what has happened, subscribe to the channel. Each episode is a piece of the same puzzle. Give it a like if this story changed something in the way you understand the world. And tell me in the comments, do you think there's an equivalent today? A corporation, a financial system, a power structure that operates the same way, just with a different name?